It's apt that the blue-green enemy color pairing is over my shoulder in my background art, because today we're going to go over the Elven Council Lord of the Rings Precon deck and what I would cut out of it to make it a little bit better and things to add back in as well. So if you didn't know what was actually in this deck, the very first thing to know is the lead commander is Galadriel Elven Queen. For 2 blue and a green, you get an Elf Noble 4/5 with Will of the Council that says at the beginning of your combat on your turn, if another elf entered the battlefield under your control this turn, starting with you, each player votes for Dominion or Guidance. If Dominion gets more votes, the ring tempts you, and then you put a +1/+1 counter on your ring bearer. If Guidance gets more votes or is tied, draw a card. So, not exactly like the most reliable thing because you don't know exactly what you're going to get out of it, and there's not a ton of the ring tempts you kind of things in this deck to kind of force it out a little bit ahead of schedule. And so for that reason, I think I'm actually going to relegate Galadriel here to the 99, but we are not going to talk about the alternate commanders in this deck because unfortunately, and we'll see them here shortly, they're getting cut from what I have here in store for this deck. But before we get to those alternate commanders, I want to go over some of the other cards that need to be trimmed out of here because for some reason there's things like Colossal Whale, 5 blue, 5/5 Island Walk that when it attacks, exile a creature defending player controls until it leaves the battlefield. This is an elf deck for the most part, and its biggest feature is about scrying. So I'm trying to figure out, it's very confusing, why this card is in this deck at all, other than, okay, we needed a big blue creature for this deck, they felt, and this was the only thing they could possibly fit in here that was not related to anything in particular to Magic the Gathering. Like, you can't put sphinxes or anything like that into Lord of the Rings because they didn't exist in the stories as far as I understand. So for that reason, I'm going to kick Colossal Whale out. The next card I'm going to punt out of here is Plea for Power, 3 and a blue sorcery with Will of the Council. Starting with you, each player votes for time or knowledge. If time gets more votes, take an extra turn after this one. If knowledge gets more votes or is tied, draw 3 cards. This, for the most part, you're always basically going to be paying 4 mana, draw 3 cards, because most players are not, unless you play some kind of really big political trickery, you're not getting an extra turn out of this card. And there are better cards available to us for 4 mana that we can do card drawing off of, and for that reason, I'm going to take it out of the deck and replace it. My next cut here is going to be Lignify. For 1 and a green, we get a tribal enchantment, Treefolk Aura, Enchanted creature is a Treefolk, it loses it all abilities and it becomes a 0/4. Now, there are better removal spells available in green. There's better bounce things in blue. There's better ways of going about than giving somebody a 0/4 wall, essentially, that can block a lot of our little elves and things like that. So for that reason, I'm going to chop this out. My next cut is basically a generic 6-drop Trampler. It's a 6/6 called Mirkwood Elk. For 5 and a green, you get a Trampling Elk that says whenever Mirkwood Elk enters the battlefield or attacks, return target elf card from your graveyard to your hand and gain life equal to that card's power. Well, most elves are only like, 1/1, 2/2, 3/3 at most. So you're not going to get a bunch of life off of this, and bringing them back over and over is great and all, but you're going to have to make sure you have an open opponent or somebody that doesn't have anything. Otherwise, you're just playing, what is that, Colossal Dreadmaw for the most part with a little bit easier casting cost. Now we're going to get into some of those alternate commanders that I was talking about that I would have showed earlier, but they were going to get the axe anyways. First up is Radagast, Wizard of the Wilds. For 2 green blue, you get a 3/5 Avatar Wizard with Ward 1. Birds and beasts you control have Ward 1, and whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, choose one. Create a 3/3 beast token or create a 2/2 bird token with flying. So, as you can see, this has nothing to do with elves, has nothing to do with scrying, has nothing to do with really anything that the deck is really wanting to do with those elves. So for that reason, this card is something that probably needs its own dedicated deck built around it. So we're going to cut it out of here and probably try to do something with it later in a different deck. Next up is Círdan the Shipwright. For 3, a green and a blue, you get a 3/4 Elf Noble with Vigilance and Secret Counsel. When it enters or attacks, each player secretly votes for a player, and then those votes are revealed. Each player draws a card for each vote they received. Each player who received no votes puts a permanent card from their hand onto the battlefield. So it's an elf, but it doesn't really further our game plan with the whole scrying and trying to do stuff to our opponents. This feels more like a group hug card where, you tell somebody, okay, I'm going to attack you with this as long as, you don't do anything like this. You're going to get something out of this card. So you can kind of play political trickery with it and things like that. But for the most part, I'm not really feeling this card as in the 99 here, but possibly something to do with, its own deck would be nice in the future. And yet another card that I'm going to cut out of this deck, Gandalf Westward Voyager. For 3 green blue, you get a 5/5 Avatar Wizard that says whenever you cast a spell with mana 5 or greater, each opponent reveals the top card of their library. If any of those cards share a type with the spell, copy it, you choose new targets for the copy, and each opponent draws a card. Otherwise, you draw a card, and the copy of a permanent becomes a token. So again, this really doesn't work really well with all these elves we have going on here. Most elves do not cost more than 4 mana, so right there automatically goes, well, this isn't really going to work with a lot of the elves that are in the deck because it's 5 or greater to get this thing to even trigger. Otherwise, you're just paying 5 mana for a 5/5 vanilla creature that doesn't really do anything unless you luck into some kind of bigger creature for the most part. And for that reason, I'm just going to kick him out of the deck too. The last of the alternate commanders here that I'm going to cut out of the deck just because it doesn't fit what I want to do with this particular layout is Elrond of the White Council. 3 green blue, 3/3 elf noble with Secret Council. When Elrond of the White Council enters the battlefield, each player secretly votes for fellowship or aid, and then the votes are revealed. For each fellowship vote, the voter chooses to choose a creature they control. You gain control of each creature chosen this way, and they gain this creature can't attack its owner. Then, for each aid vote, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Again, this doesn't further our plans with the scrying and whatnot, and it's also not really that easy to abuse. We don't have any kind of cloning available to us in the deck. We don't have any kind of extensive bounce and replay value. We don't have any flicker value. There's just a lot of things going against this card being more than a one-shot trick, and for that reason, I'm going to cut it out of the deck. We're down to the last couple of cuts here. First up, we have Learn from the Past. 3 and a blue instant. Target player shuffles their graveyard into their library and then draws a card. So, it's great to be able to recycle your library and everything like that, but for the most part, I really don't see a reason why we would want this in a deck that's dedicated to elves, and so I'm going to punt it here. And then the last card I'm going to cut is Hornet Queen. 4 triple green for a 2/2 insect with flying and death touch. When it enters the battlefield, create 4 green insect tokens with flying and death touch. So, it's a great army in a can. It's a great threat and all that stuff, and it fits the theme of being, part of the woodlands or whatever for Lord of the Rings. But again, I'm leaning very heavily into the elf synergies and whatnot in this deck and a lot of the scry synergies. So for that reason, I am going to send it packing. So I've revealed my cuts for the deck. Now, I already said I was going to basically kick all the commanders out of this deck because I wasn't a fan of how they really interacted with the deck for the most part. So what are we going to do with that? Well, instead, we're going to focus on another commander for this deck, and it's one that I played against in the pre-release this last weekend, and it is kind of scary if it gets going. So who fits the bill for this deck and is scary? Well, it's Elrond, Master of Healing. For 2, a green and a blue, you get a 4/4 Elf Noble that says whenever you scry, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to X target creatures, where X is the number of cards looked at this way while scrying. Whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. This thing I came up against in the very first game of the very first round of the pre-release, and it was frightening, and that was in limited. So just think what we can do in a constructed format where we can kind of make the deck do what we want it to do and feed in, a bunch of different scrying cards and whatnot. Basically, this goes, you scry, say you scry 2, so you can put a +1/+1 counter on 2 creatures, or you can scry 4 and put a counter on up to 4 other creatures. You can kind of make your little wimpy elves into something massively scary, and this thing is bonkers, and for that reason, I want it in front of this deck. But since we're leaning heavily into the scrying theme, I also want to use this other variation of Elrond. It's the Elrond, Lord of Rivendell. For 2 and a blue, you get a 3/2 Elf Noble that says when it enters or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. If this is the second time this ability has resolved this turn, the rating tempts you. So it's pretty easy if you play, a couple of cheap creatures to get 2 scries off of this, and then you go ahead and do this. Or you can, when it enters the battlefield, you can play it and then one other creature, and then you'll get the trigger and you'll get to, create a ring bearer for you to do things with. So I kind of like how it fits in with the scry theme, so I'm adding it in. Another on-theme card for us here is the Fall of Gil-galad. For 1 and a green, you get a saga with Chapter 1, Scry 2, which fits the Scry theme we want. Chapter 2, put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature we control, so it makes our little elves a lot more threatening. And until end of turn on Chapter 3, target creature you control gains when this creature dies, draw 2 cards, and then that creature fights up to 1 other target creature. So if you need, cards in a pinch, you can, basically, it's essentially a sacrifice type thing, where you can sacrifice that creature using the fight mechanic here to get rid of the creature and go ahead and draw a card off of your crappiest creature, or you can use it to go ahead and kill one of their creatures, and in the trade-off, you're going to refill your hand as well. So for that reason, I like this card too. In that same deck that I faced against that Elrond that we're going to use as the commander here, I also faced off against this card, Glorfindel, Dauntless Rescuer. For 2 and a green, you get a 3/2 elf noble that says when you scry, choose 1, and Glorfindel, Dauntless Rescuer gets +1/+1 until end of turn. You either choose he must be blocked this turn if able, or he can't be blocked by more than 1 creature this combat this turn. So this thing is kind of nuts, because if you scry enough times, you can make it pretty big and basically turn it into a removal spell for your opponent's creatures, because you're like, okay, you have to block this, so you're going to lose 1 of your creatures. Or you can force it to be like, okay, it's big enough that it can kill any 1 of your creatures that I want dead, and you're going to have to block it with something, but you can only block it with 1 rather than try to gang block it. So it creates interesting combat synergies with the scrying that we're doing, so I'm going to add it in. Can you sense the theme here? We got another Scry synergy with Arwen Undamiel. For green-blue, you get a 2/2 elf noble that says whenever you scry, put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature and an activated ability of 4 colors, a green and a blue, to scry 2. So it's got its own built-in scry engine, kind of pricey for what it is, but that's not a huge deal here. But the big thing here is whenever you scry with anything else, you can put a counter on a creature. So you can sit here and just, do a bunch of scry triggers. And again, you can bolster your armies and get them nice and big and fat before you go swinging in. While we don't have a ton of ways to get the ring to tempt us, this card is interesting because it does have some scry action going on for us. This is Galadriel of Lothlorien. For 1, a green and a blue, you get a 3/3 elf noble that says whenever the ring tempts you, if you chose a creature other than this Galadriel as your ring bearer, scry 3. And whenever you scry, you can reveal the top card of your library. If it is a land that is revealed, you can put it onto the battlefield tapped. So this has a lot of things going for it. If we're gonna go with some tempting cards in here, we get 3 scries, which works out really well with our Elrond and some of these other creatures as well. And then whenever you scry, you basically can get a free land off the top of your deck into play tapped. So it has a lot of things going on for it. So for that reason, I want to give it a try here and use it in this deck. When I first was looking at things to update this deck with, I kind of overlooked this card until I read it a little closer. Elvish Mariner is a 2 and a blue 3/2 elf pilot that says when it attacks, scry 1, and whenever you scry, tap up to X target non-land permanents, where X is the number of cards looked at while scrying this way. So for sure, you can tap 1 thing when it attacks because it scries for 1, but then if you're using any other scry effects, you can tap down multiple permanents with that ability. So like if you have something that says scry 2, you can tap down 2 and then swing, and you can tap down a 3rd creature with this, no problem. So I got so confused. I was like, oh, I thought this was just on its own scry that it was locked into, and it was like, that's not very good. But actually, since it can activate off of any other scries as well, that is just really, really good, because you can tap down a bunch of blockers, you can tap down incoming attackers. So like if you have an instant speed scry spell in your hand, you could be like, okay, before attackers are declared, scry 2 or whatever, and I'll lock down your 2 biggest attackers so you can't hurt me that much. And then again, you can take down the biggest, baddest blockers in your way on the attacks as well. The last card I'm going to add in from the main set before we get into some actual older Magic cards is Glorious Gale. For 1 and a blue, you get an instant that says counter target creature spell. If it was legendary, the ring tempts you. So for all intents and purposes, since this is for commander, you're basically pay to counter somebody's commander, and then the ring will tempt you. It's really good, and it synergizes with some of the things we got going on in the deck, and it gives us just a cheap counter that's a little less mean than some other counters can be, but then again, it also helps us keep opposing commanders that are kind of scary under control as well for a cheap cost. Now I have 2 cards that are, from older Magic that synergize well here and kind of fit in with the Lord of the Rings world. The first one is Crystal Ball. For 3 colorless, you get an artifact that says pay 1, tap, scry 2. So it gives you a scry on demand. that you can use at any point without, having a spell in hand. You can do it in response to something, whatever you need to do, you can do it with this card. And I think, that there's going to be some kind of wizards or other, seers in the world of Middle Earth that would actually carry a crystal ball around. So for that reason, I like this in the deck. And the last card is Foresee. For 3 and a blue, you get a sorcery with Scry 4 and then draw 2 cards. And we took out Plea for Power, but this is what I'm going to replace it with because it has this Scry 4 attached to the front of it. Because like I said, you're not really going to see that extra turn off of that other card very often. So for one last card draw, we get to Scry 4 instead, dig 4 cards deeper into our deck, draw 2, but then we get all of the Scry synergies that we have going on here. And, first, this card actually sounds like something that would happen in this world, especially since Galadriel has like her scrying pool that she uses in the movie and in the books and stuff. So I kind of like how she could foresee what was going to happen to the Shire in the movie and, things like that. So I kind of feel like this spell would work. The art's kind of funky here, but I like the spell and I think it would fit this world. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in. So what did you guys think? Is there something I probably should have put in here or should not have put in here? Something else I should have cut out for these things? Let me know in the comments below. As I've said in the past here with these other decks, the best thing you can do if you don't want to rip a bunch of cards out of here and add a bunch of stuff in is just to fix the mana bases and do the blue-green duels that will fit this deck's colors. And that will improve your deck much more than just about any other spell you could fling in the deck. As always, thank you for watching. Have a great day, and the Forces of Mordor deck is coming next.